Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Thursday, September 24th. And as you know, we have three short stories to work with today: Young Goodman Brown, Soldier's Home, and finally Battle Royal, which would leave two short stories for us to finish up with next class. And then that will put some closure to our short story unit so we can talk a little bit more about writing papers and also finally move forward into the drama section. We're a little bit behind, but that's okay. We can catch up in the drama section. So I had left you with some attendance questions about thinking about an important detail in one of the short stories. And luckily, you all selected different short stories. So I encourage you all to read each other's comments and my comments because that'll give you a good overview of some important points. And I also wanted to talk about some of the important points as well. In terms of Young Goodman Brown, which was written in 1835, so this is an older piece, and as some of you indicated, the symbolism is very deliberate. So Faith is not just necessarily Goodman's wife, but Faith also happens to be his religious faith. And this kind of story is called an allegory. It's representational, it's figurative, where basically everything that occurs in the story has a representational meaning, right? Beginning with the title, Young Goodman Brown. Young, the representation of young oftentimes leads to associations of being innocent and naive, which is what Young Goodman Brown is, because this is going to be a coming of age story, and he's going to be learning about humanity as a whole throughout the course of the story. Goodman, and he is a good man, obviously, but Goodman would have been used as a title during the time period, much like Mr. or Mrs. And Brown, lots of color association with Brown. Not only is it a common name, and one might suggest that his experiences about learning about the evil that exists in all of humanity is a common experience we are all going to be having, but Brown also is the color of soil. And since this story takes place in the wilderness, we can say that that is very appropriate because Goodman Brown learns about how ultimately humanity has soiled or is soiled by sin, and even he himself has been soiled by sin, whether he's willing to accept it or not. And then we move to the idea of this story taking place in Salem and all of the associations with the Salem witch trials, because the plot of the story would seem to suggest that perhaps a witch meeting occurs. And we'll get back to that in a moment. The time is sunset, which represents darkness and descent. And the wilderness represents that which is wild or untamed. We oftentimes see that utilized in fairy tales. And even the fact that Goodman is a newlywed, which is also representative of being innocent and naive. In fact, he's been married 3 months, and three is a very powerful Christian symbol for the Trinity, for instance, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. And then the traveler that Goodman meets that seems to have some sort of supernatural abilities. He has a staff, for instance, that seems to move, and it almost looks like a snake. In fact, all of these are associations that could be made with the devil. And we have to wonder throughout the text, is Goodman being met by a kind of devil figure that's tempting Goodman, much like the devil tempted Adam and Eve, into forbidden knowledge. But in terms of the background of this story, it's important to know about the Puritans, which is the religion of the time. The Puritans were persecuted because of their strict Christian religion. They were English, and in fact, they were persecuted so badly they left England and they relocated to America and founded New England, which is what the history or the background is of our particular area in Massachusetts. And in fact, once they relocated to New England, they began to persecute others, specifically in the Salem witch trials. So the irony is thick, and part of this story is not only about irony, but about the hypocrisy of humanity, which is what we see. If you know anything at all about the Salem witch trials, oftentimes women who are considered to be outsiders in society were targeted as witches. But we do see lots of sin and hypocrisy and humanity as a whole in this piece, even though the Puritan ideology maintained that either you were sinful and you were damned, or you were pure and you would be going to heaven. And there was no in between. And in this story, we see there's lots of in between. So the People who could be guilty of sin and hypocrisy include church leaders, and that includes Goody Cloyce, and she's important because she taught Goodman Brown his catechism. In other words, she was his Sunday school teacher. Politicians, and while we might snicker at that now, that politicians might be guilty of sin, definitely what we can see in this particular text is that it would have been surprising for the time period. Professionals, the leading citizens of the day, could be guilty of sin. Widows could be guilty of sin. Family members could be guilty of sin. And in fact, this traveler devil figure makes references to Goodman as well, and Goodman's family in the past, and that this figure has had interactions with both, such as Goodman's father. The suggestion being that evil has existed in Goodman's family in prior generations. And in fact, since this is a journey that Goodman is taking that Faith was trying to stop him from taking, the idea that there's something untoward or amiss with him taking this journey would suggest that Goodman himself knows that he's engaging in evil or walking into temptation. Perhaps the journey we all have to take when we walk into temptation at one point or another, and we have to come of age and realize that evil and basically fallibility exists within everybody. And we even have to accept that within ourselves, which is perhaps the hardest lesson to accept. Lots of ambiguity in this text, and it's deliberate because we can never be certain whether a witch meeting actually occurs, whether this figure is actually a devil figure, or whether this was all just a dream or a hallucination of Goodman's. And in fact, Nathaniel Hawthorne directly addresses this question at the end by asking, had Goodman Brown fallen asleep and dreamt a dream of a witch meeting? And the response is, be it so if you will. In other words, yeah, whatever. That it's not important whether the events occurred or not. What's important is what Goodman learns or doesn't learn as a result of these events. And if you were a deconstructionist critic, we had talked about how deconstructionists go through texts and try to find basically places of contradiction. They would love this particular text because every time there seems to be a piece of evidence to suggest there was a witch meeting, for instance, the trees were lit on fire, there's another piece of evidence that would seem to negate that. For instance, now the trees are covered with dew. And when we see the devil's staff wriggling, the response from Goodman is that it seemed like it was a snake which is associated with the devil and the evil, but it must have been an ocular deception. In other words, it must have been a figment of his imagination. And this is done very deliberately by the author, so you will never come to a conclusion as to whether or not a witch meeting occurred or not, because frankly, it's not important. What's important is what we learn about humanity, and that all of humanity is capable of sin, regardless of what Puritan ideology says. And in fact, humanity also is filled with ambiguity, good and bad and good. Think about someone like Faith, who's supposed to be representational of good. She's at this supposed witch meeting, which suggests that she also is involved somehow with something untoward or evil. But even her ribbons, a ribbon is supposed to represent innocence, which is what Faith is supposed to be, an innocent. But the ribbons are pink. And the Puritans were known for their very simple dress and in dressing black and white, avoiding color because color was seen as sinful. And particularly a color like pink, which is so close to red and all of the erotic associations with red that we talked about with Rose for Emily. So throughout the text, we see this ambiguity. And the lesson ultimately to us is that everyone is capable of sin, regardless of how pure they might appear on the exterior, regardless of whether or not they worship regularly in church. And that humanity as a whole has the possibility of sin. What we see with Goodman is that this truth destroys him. He dies basically with no hopeful verse upon his tomb. Because he loses all of his faith. And the lesson to us, obviously, is not just that we should accept that evil exists in everyone, including ourselves, but that doesn't mean that we should lose all of our faith, because basically, at this point, Goodman becomes so disenchanted with humanity that he isolates himself and ends up being a darkly meditative and distrustful man. And that's not what should happen to us when our faith happens to be questioned or our faith happens to be destroyed in something. That's the ultimate lesson in this particular text. Now, moving forward to Soldier's Home, this is a more contemporary text, so it's probably easier to read than something like Young Goodman Brown, which was written in the 1800s. So the language was much more antiquated. If you know anything about Nathaniel Hawthorne, that's very typical of his style. You might have read, for instance, A Scarlet Letter, and know that Nathaniel Hawthorne oftentimes has moral and religious lessons embedded within his text. Soldier's Home, written by Ernest Hemingway, is written in a more simple manner. That doesn't mean it's simplistic. Ernest Hemingway is known for writing in a simple, straightforward style that's very dialogue-based. It's usually easier to read dialogue than it is to read text, which is why it's usually easier to watch a television show or to watch a drama than it would be to actually read something. So we learn a lot through dialogue. But we can also learn a lot through the title as well, Soldier's Home. Obviously, the story is about a soldier and what it means to be a veteran. In other words, what does it mean to return home? But I think the more important part of the title is the piece about home. What is home? Where is home? Krebs has returned to his hometown, but does not feel like he is at home because he is not understood. In fact, there is a difference between a house, the physical residence, and the home, a place where you feel wanted and loved. And we definitely see that in this story. And as many of you indicated in your attendance question, what he seems to be suffering from is PTSD, a modern day term, post-traumatic stress disorder. At the time, it would have been known as shell shock. There was very little understanding of what it meant to be a soldier returning home during that time period. I suppose you could even say the same of today, but even less so in the early 1900s. And that's evidenced just with the use of calling Krebs by his surname, Krebs, which is what is done in the military, the use of the surname to remove someone's individuality. And a little interesting factoid here, Krebs means cancer in German, and one can say that war is like a cancer that continues to spread and that cannot be stopped. Certainly that happens to be the case when Krebs has returned, but yet he's misunderstood. In part, what happened to him in the military is he learned the ugly reality of war, which is evidenced in the picture that is referenced very early on in the story. That this is a picture where the Rhine doesn't show, that the men are too big for their uniforms, and the girls are not pretty. The fact that the Rhine is not showing, this is supposed to be a tourist attraction, and one of the ways the military was portrayed in a romanticized way during the time period, perhaps even today, that you could see the world. Well, that wasn't necessarily the case in the picture. The uniforms don't fit, and oftentimes the idea of being in uniform and being attractive, particularly to the opposite sex. Opposite sex would have been female, since males would have been serving in the war. That said, the girls are not pretty, so even if they are attractive to the opposite sex, this romanticized idea of having a relationship is negated through that picture. And in fact, the fact that they're too big for their uniforms, you can say that they've outgrown this romanticized version of what war and serving in the military is supposed to be, especially in the way that it would have been portrayed in the early 1900s. And instead, what they end up finding is that civilians are fickle and superficial, which is illustrated when Krebs returns back and finds out that he's returned back too late, that the hero's greeting is over. And can you imagine that someone is somehow less heroic based on the time in which they return? Or the fact that Krebs feels this need to continually lie to either make the events that he experienced seem more exciting and interesting, or to make the events he experienced seem less brutal and gory. And the idea that people want to be entertained rather than be told the truth, or civilians want that, and that only soldiers and veterans understand the reality of that. So much so that Krebs is spending his time basically isolated, engaged in solitary activities at home. He's reading, he's having lunch at home, practicing clarinet, even playing pool. And think about some of the significance with playing pool, because when you play pool, you have to aim and shoot, which is similar to what a soldier has to do, aim and shoot. We could say that Krebs has never really left the military. In fact, he spends his time reading in order to be able to get validation that what he did was important and what he did was useful. And as a result of all of this, he begins to question religion. And we don't know what his religious background was, but he did go to a Methodist college. His mother does pray and asks him to pray. So one assumes that religion had some role in his life, but it no longer does. Not too surprising that he would question religion after the brutality and horrors that he had seen. And he wants absolutely no consequences in his life, no romantic relationships, no intimate relationships, certainly, because that requires a certain level of connection that he's unable to give and probably fearful to give. You can't have too much connection in the military because you might end up losing the people that you're connected with in the midst of war. And this idea that he's already had so many consequences being a soldier, he doesn't want any now. He wishes he could have a relationship like he had with the women in Germany. And the difference is that the women in Germany didn't speak English. So they didn't have to get into any kind of intimate conversations the way he would have to now. And as I had indicated, so much of Krebs' relationships is are evidenced based on the dialogue that he's having with his family. With his sister, for instance, she refers to him as Herr, and this happens to be a nickname, which illustrates that their relationship is probably closer than the average relationship. That's usually when you use a nickname. Herr also means rabbit, and there's associations with being timid and shy, and one could say that's where Krebs is now. He's sort of hiding in his rabbit hole now that he's returned back from war. You can even think about soldiers and having to be in foxholes. But nevertheless, she asks him to watch her play indoor baseball. In other words, she wants him to be part of her life. She admires him. She respects him. She probably has the most respect for him, a kind of hero worship, if you will. Keep that in mind when she asks if he will be her beau. She doesn't necessarily mean that in a romantic way, which is why he's able to accept, because there won't really be any kind of consequences. It's almost like a young child saying that they're going to marry their parent. There's a certain level of innocence there, so he understands that he's not necessarily going to be held accountable. So he's humoring her in some ways. So this is not necessarily an erotic episode. Harold's conversation with his mother. Now, she calls him Harold to show the fact that basically she has a connection with him as mother and son. And she talks to him about the family car and how ultimately she and the father have decided he should be able to use it. Think about what a car represents: independence, freedom, adulthood. Which is something that they think that if they offer Krebs, then he will in turn pay them back, so to speak, by being, quote, normal, unquote. Finding a girlfriend, getting married, getting a job, buying a house, which is what she says that his peers are doing, but he's unable to do that because of the trauma that he's experienced during war. And this is why he doesn't want the car, because he knows the car comes with strings and the price is too high for him. And of course, the mother wants him to pray, and he's unable to do so. And in fact, the mother asks him point blank at one point, "Do you love me?" And he says no. And there's probably a certain level of truth to that, and that ultimately it's probably hard for him to love anybody, because love comes with a certain level of consequence, and it comes with a certain level of vulnerability that he may not be able to give at this particular point. Though certainly he does care about what his family thinks, so in that respect he loves them. Which perhaps might explain the ending. He goes to Kansas City, or he decides he'll go to Kansas City, get a job, and basically he's going to watch his sister play indoor baseball. We could see that as a positive, and that he's becoming more, quote, normal, unquote, reintegrating back into society. We can also see that as a negative, because he's doing this merely to appease his family, and that's not where his heart is. Or we can see this as an act of salvation, where ultimately he realizes that he can never change his family, so therefore he may as well leave and then ultimately try to start a new life for himself. Or perhaps all three are accurate on some level, which is how we talked about literature can be so complex, because we can read it from so many different perspectives. That said, when we think about some of the dialogue he never has dialogue with his father. Basically, it's all through his mother, who works as basically translator. And basically what we find out here is that by not having any kind of direct conversation with his father, what we see is that he has no close relationship with his father. And we don't know if that was necessarily the case prior to his going to war, but it certainly is the case now. And then if I were to talk about the third piece, which is Battle Royal in the novel Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. Invisible Man being a very long and complex novel, and I had indicated that in some ways you're at a somewhat disadvantage because what you are doing is you're just reading the opening chapter. However, that opening chapter was initially released as a short story, so it can stand on its own. But giving you a little bit of background about the novel as a whole might be useful, because after the episode of Battle Royal and he receives a scholarship, he goes to college on that scholarship. And he spends a good 200 or so pages in college. It's a rather long novel. And what he realizes is that he's an invisible man in college. In other words, he will never be given respect purely because of the color of his skin. And it doesn't matter how educated he is, and it doesn't matter how hard he works. So at that point, he makes a decision and he decides that what needs to be restructured is the political system that is allowing inequality to exist. So he gets involved in politics for approximately 200 pages or so. And then what he realizes is that the political system is fixed and it's deliberate, that he will never be given equality purely because of the color of his skin. So the last part of the novel, the last 200 pages or so, is when he meets a character named Ross the Destroyer. And he's exactly that, a destroyer. And basically what Ross the Destroyer convinces the Invisible Man of is that they need to basically have social uprising. They need to destroy the system in place and start anew. And they do that for about 200 pages. The end result is a huge riot where the Invisible Man sees his community burning around him. And then he realizes that that too is not the answer. So this is all portrayed in the context of a frame where the very opening of the novel begins with the Invisible Man who happens to be in a basement. He's surrounded by darkness, but he's rigged it up with thousands of lights, so he's surrounded by light. Electricity that he's stealing from the electric company or the power company. In a basement he would never be allowed to live in because it's in an all-Caucasian neighborhood. And he talks about how he's hibernating, and that in order to understand why he's hibernating, we need to know his story, which begins with the Battle Royal. And that's what we're presented with, Battle Royal. And then we find out about his time in college. We find out about his time trying to engage in political revolution. And then we find out about his time trying to engage in social revolution. And then the very ending of the novel is as it began, with him in the basement, in the dark, but surrounded by thousands and thousands of lights. From power, he stole it from the power company, because power, who has it and who doesn't, is a major theme in the novel. And how he's hibernating. He's trying to find a solution for the inequality that exists. In other words, he hasn't done so. And when we end the novel, we as readers, and keep in mind this novel came out in 1947, are challenged to try to find a solution. And in some ways we have found some solutions in 2020, but certainly not as many as we needed to or we hoped to, in terms of some of the social ills such as racism and sexism and classism as well. And the opening chapter of this novel, Battle Royal, you can tell already that battles are a major theme in this story. Not only the literal boxing match that this character engages in, that's a battle, but also all of the battles against society and the battles within himself, and trying to understand what his grandfather teaches him at the beginning. What we find out is that at the very beginning, this is an adult narrator who is reflecting back on his youth. And he calls himself invisible, not because he has any supernatural elements associated with him, but he's invisible because of his ethnicity, and that he will never be seen because he's black. And he talks about how he needed to learn this in his youth. And his grandfather tried to teach him this on the grandfather's deathbed, when the grandfather on his deathbed confessed that he was a spy in the enemy's country, that he had lived his life with his head in the lion's mouth. And he wanted the Invisible Man to overcome him with yeses. So what does that mean? The grandfather has been pretending to be meek and subversive, or submissive rather, to the Caucasian society around him in order to gain access and power, because that was the only way he could gain access and power. That's how he was a spy in the enemy's country. That's how he lived with his head in the lion's mouth being Caucasian society. And overcome him with yeses is the grandfather telling the invisible man to pretend, to lie that he's meek and submissive and just say yes so that he can gain access and opportunity. The invisible man didn't understand that when he was a youth. Instead, when he graduated from high school, he gave such an impressive speech that the invisible man was invited by some of the leading men, Caucasian, in his society to read a speech. And the invisible man mistakenly believes this is a great honor, that they want to basically acknowledge his intelligence and his education. What he doesn't know is that it's all a setup, that this is all done as a way to brutalize and humiliate him and other blacks. Because when the invisible man gets there and sees all of the leading citizens there, they've set up basically a boxing match so that he and other African Americans can fight one another. And we see not only brutal episodes, but horrific use of the N-word. And at one point, a naked blonde is presented to them. This is an episode where we can see some level of sexism because the female is objectified as just a piece of flesh. It's also a way to continue to brutalize and humiliate the blacks because they probably feel some sexual excitement with seeing this naked blonde. In fact, there's even physical evidence that they are feeling some physical excitement. But they're not allowed to show that. That could be something that could be punishable by death in the 1940s for a black man to show any kind of interest in a white woman. And it's no mistake that she has an American flag tattooed right above her pelvis. The American flag is supposed to represent America. And the idea that for these men, they can look, but they can't touch, which is what the American dream is for the invisible man. We can show it to you, but you can't really have it. And that's something the invisible man is going to be learning. Eventually, the woman is, quote, rescued from her plight. And then the boxing match begins. There's a good amount of black and white imagery in this text, right down to what the men are wearing, tuxedos. Tuxedos are black and white. To what the men are smoking, black cigars. To the gift that is wrapped up for the invisible man. The briefcase with the scholarship is wrapped in white tissue paper. So you can see dark and light and black and white imagery throughout this particular piece. That boxing match being a metaphor for the societal battles that minorities face or people of color face in light of Caucasian society. And also the personal battles, because the invisible man is basically fighting against the grandfather's words. That said, on some subconscious level, the invisible man must understand. He does try to rescue the woman. You know, he says that he wants to try to protect her from these horrors, as well as he wants her erotically, and he knows he's not supposed to want her erotically. At one point, he tries to topple over the chair of one of the leading citizens who happen to be taunting and abusing the woman and others. That could lead to the death of the invisible man. And when he is finally giving his graduation speech after he's been humiliated, and he says he's swallowing blood, and that's literal and figurative, he makes an error. And instead of saying social responsibility, he says social equality. Now, there's a psychological theory that says that there is no such thing as a mistake. The slip of the tongue is basically something that's subconscious that comes out. And there is a huge difference between social equality as opposed to social responsibility. So one suspects that at least on some psychological level, the invisible man is fighting for his rights. The invisible man has understood what the grandfather's been trying to tell him, even though the invisible man engages in the boxing match, convinced that if he can show his superiority, then he can give his speech and he can be acknowledged for it. And the other boxer, because this has all been fixed, so the invisible man is going to be left with the strongest boxer there. The invisible man tries to convince the other boxer, let's fix the match so that we can end this brutality. And the other boxer says no. And the Invisible Man says, why? For them? And the boxer says, no, for me. That this is the only way this boxer, this African American, can achieve any kind of pride or dignity is by winning this brutal boxing match. Even at the end, when it turns out that they should have been paid for participating in this boxing match, as if payment could in any way compensate for the horrors they've experienced. It's fake payment. These are card tokens that are on an electrified rug, and I can tell you that not only do the leading Caucasian citizens take great delight in seeing the African Americans being electrified as they're trying to grab these tokens, but it illustrates the idea of electricity and power that I was referencing earlier with the Invisible Man, when at the very beginning and the very ending of the novel, he basically is stealing power from the power company. And electricity, of course, is light, and the Invisible Man is in a dark basement when he's talking about this. So he gives his graduation speech and is called to account for social equality, and he denies that he meant to say social equality. He says he's swallowing blood, because he is indeed swallowing blood to have to say social responsibility, whether he consciously realizes that or not. And then he's given the scholarship, which happens to be in a briefcase and all of the associations with success and professionalism. The Invisible Man is quite happy. And then he goes home and he talks about that even the portrait of his grandfather couldn't have negated his happiness. It reminds me almost like the portrait of Miss Emily's father that's always there, even though the father is dead. And same with the grandfather. Even though the grandfather is no longer alive, the grandfather is always there. And then the Invisible Man has a dream. And this dream is negative foreshadowing, which becomes clear when we read the novel as a whole. And his dream, and oftentimes dreams have symbolic significance. The dream is that he's at a circus with his grandfather, and his grandfather refuses to laugh at the clowns. In other words, his grandfather refuses to do what he's supposed to do. In other words, it's not funny. And in other words, the circus is really the world that we all live in, that could judge somebody by the color of their skin. And basically, the grandfather tells the Invisible Man to open up the envelope with his scholarship. And it's one envelope after another envelope after another envelope. It's almost like those Russian nesting dolls. In other words, it takes him an inordinate amount of time to get to finally the last envelope. In other words, he's being made to play a game. And this is the game that the Invisible Man is going to have to play throughout his entire life. The game that the grandfather was alluding to about overcome him with yeses and be a spy in the enemy's country and live with your head in the lion's mouth. And finally, the very last envelope has a message that says, keep this end boy running. And in other words, basically what the message is that the Invisible Man will never be able to reach his destination. The destination being trying to achieve respect and acknowledgement and equality. He's going to be kept running a game where it's completely and totally rigged, and he's just participating for the entertainment and amusement of others. So this gives you an idea, briefly, of these 3 short stories. What I thought I would do for today's attendance question is to ask you, out of the 3 stories, which story did you dislike the most? I know we're used to talking about which ones we like the most, but which story did you dislike the most and why? I'll be curious to hear your responses. Next class, I can finish up with any odds and ends with these 3 short stories. Finish up our last 2 short stories in the short story unit, Girl and Popular Mechanics. And they're very short indeed, only about a page and a half long or so. And then we can talk about things like journals, papers, and finally move into our next unit, which happens to be drama. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And I look forward to seeing which story you disliked the most and why. Take care. Bye-bye.